Hello, thank you for having me at this year's MEMSA conference. Today I will be presenting on enslaved giants, the role of monstrous mitigation in contesting boundaries in the medieval Bevis-Tradition. Modern criticism of giants in early middle literature is largely concerned with the exclusion of these monstrous figures as antitheses to mankind. They often act as a reflection of the reader's fears and desires projected onto a foreign body, as the physical embodiment of otherness manifested in a hybrid form. Myths depict these supernatural characters as the foundation builders of natural phenomena, relegated to the legendary past. As delineation of the boundaries of humanity and monstrosity, they represent the other by which every self is defined. The early Middle European romances, in particular, engage with this concept, upon occasion bringing these monstrous figures into the narrative. They provide a platform to experiment with hybridity and monstrosity, offering an insight into how medieval societies perceived themselves. I will be addressing an understudied and relatively unexplored area of this field, the enslaved giant, where these bodies of extreme otherness are placed firmly within the reassuring familiarity of human society. This paper will explore the giant character of Ascapard in the early Middle Bevis tradition, focusing on the portrayal of the giant in relation to the boundary between human and other, to understand to what extent this hybrid figure embodied exclusion and belonging. I will be considering the representation of this border through a comparative analysis of two texts within this tradition, to begin to understand the development of the medieval understanding of otherness in this period. For those who are not familiar with the legend, Bevis of Hampton represents a fairly traditional romance. The story traces the heroic arc of Bevis, following his battle to secure his kingship. Along the way, he predictably falls in love with a fair maiden called Josiane and faces many trials, one of which is the defeat of the giant Ascapard, whom he enslaves as his page until the giant betrays him and is slain. The legend belongs to a large and complex literary tradition, with versions spreading throughout Europe during the early Middle period. There are 6 surviving manuscripts, and it is widely accepted that all European versions are descended from the Anglo-Norman text. This paper will refer to the early 13th century Anglo-Norman text found in fragments of French manuscripts, and the 14th century Middle English text, surviving in the Auchinlecht manuscript. I will also be relying on Judith Weiss's excellent translation of the Anglo-Norman text. Much can be garnered from a comparative reading of these texts. Whilst it is debated in the medieval community whether the term translation can be used to describe the later text's relationship with its earlier source, the two poems share roughly the same plot and characters. Both texts share a common foundation, placing Bevis firmly in the role of an unjustly scorned hero, with Ascapard as the property of, and entirely subject to, his will. The differences between these texts are worthy of note, as they offer an insight into the changing opinions of medieval audiences towards the themes of the texts. For the purpose of this paper, I will be analysing 2 particular scenes in both texts, the scene in which we are introduced to the giant, and the scene in which he betrays Bevis to his enemy. The first pivotal moment, which challenges the boundaries of otherness in the texts, is seen in the introduction to the character of the giant, where the topic of monstrous bodies is explored. Our first encounter with Ascapard in the Anglo-Norman Bevis de Hampton is abrasive in its level of detail, introducing the giant as a monstrous and savage Saracen. Everything about this scene is intended to place Ascapard firmly outside of the boundaries of humanity and normality. In all aspects, he is portrayed as an outsider. This extract features 29 lines of description before Ascapard speaks, portraying his physical monstrosity as his dominating characteristic. The scene builds up layers to his otherness, reinforcing it with every line, resulting in a figure of utter monstrosity situated resolutely outside of Bevis and the reader's physical, moral, and symbolic borders. The first of these layers is social. The first word used to describe Ascapard is velin, or churl, a term used before the giant has even spoken, relying on the standard assumption that class can be discerned from appearance. Even from a distance, reposing on top of a hill, Ascapard's difference is clear. The second layer of his otherness is his inescapable physical scale. The narrator's description is peppered with numerical quantifications of Ascapard's extreme size, detailing his 9 feet tall height, club which 10 men could carry, and space between his eyes that was a foot wide. These serve not only to emphasize the giant's extreme size, but to help the reader and listeners of this poem create a vivid picture of this monstrous form, further reiterating the importance of his physical body in the narrative. The third layer of Escopart's otherness is built up through his racial difference. Only one line is needed to make this difference abundantly clear. His skin was blacker than ink. This in itself establishes Escapart far beyond the boundaries of the predominantly white medieval society, and finalizes the reader's mental image of a truly foreign figure. It is worthy of note that the only other time a character's skin colour is mentioned in the poem is with regards to Josiane, who is described as more fresh of colour than a rose in the shade. As a detail which bears little relevance in the rest of the poem, Escapart's skin is being used here as another means to establish his otherness by relying on its dual exclusion, both symbolically and geographically. The last layer established in this scene regards Escapart's speech. Even his language is characterized by its otherness, compared to the baying of a hound. Here, the exploitation of the giant's hybridity can clearly be seen. Whilst he is able to communicate with Bove, his speech retains the carnal monstrosity of an animal and remains distant from the eloquence of mankind. The dialogue between Bove and Escapart further entrenches the giant's otherness. Escapart is not allowed the dignity of individuality. Instead, he is defined through his race. Introducing himself as l'Escapart, he gives himself the name of his race rather than a proper noun, the only character to do so in the text. This clearly establishes him as belonging to a group outside of the symbolic and geographical boundaries of society. Bove's first question to the giant also relies on this physical displacement, asking, "When were you born and of what race?" To which Escapart replies, "I am a fierce pagan." Furthermore, an extra element of exclusion is added when Escapart divulges a detail of his past, recounting, "When I was in my land, everyone, great and small, mocked me and called me a dwarf." This concludes the giant's lengthy introduction by firmly establishing him as a segregated figure. Even within his own people, he was considered an other. This first encounter clearly and decisively places the giant outside of the boundaries of society and humanity, setting the tone for the rest of the text by creating a figure portrayed as the embodiment of difference. The introduction to the character of Escapart in the Middle English Bevis of Hampton shows many physical similarities with its Anglo-Norman source. Yet there are many elements of otherness which are absent, creating a character which sits on the boundary of hybridity. Lacking some of the clear-cut, stereotypically monstrous traits seen in Escapart, the Middle English Escapart represents a blurring of the boundaries between human and other. Escapart is introduced in a fairly stereotypical manner, relying on the characteristic distortion of a physical body to symbolize moral transgressions. Despite the fact that this scene is almost identical in content in the two poems, in contrast to the 39 lines in the Anglo-Norman dedicated to describing Escapart, the Middle English only features 12 lines of description. This is interesting considering the Anglo-Norman text is overall roughly 500 lines shorter than the Middle English. The later text appears to focus on the dialogue between Bevis and Escapart far more than the giant's appearance, suggesting their relationship and the giant's character are of greater importance than his physical monstrosity in the poem. Escapart is first described as a géant with luthliche semlant, using the term luthli, meaning fearsome, horrible, terrifying, which had become a common trope of giants in early Middle English literature. He is described with likewise stereotypical vocabulary. He is wunderliche strong, strengere than other 10, and wields a club lit body of an oak. In identical wording to the Anglo-Norman, he also features a space of a foot between his brow. However, a remarkable difference is seen in his size. In comparison to Escapart's 9-foot height, Escapart is described at an astonishing 30 feet. This extreme size, rather than increasing his barbarity, makes him appear comically oversized, starting a trend which sees this giant figure descend into a comical character. There are many elements in this scene that belittle Escapart's monstrosity, transforming this menacing giant figure into submissive and comic character. He immediately fills a passive role in the text. In his first breath, he introduces himself as the property of another, stating "Garsi mi sente hiderwart." A few lines later, this ownership is repeated. Portrayed as a character governed by another greater than he, it is no surprise that Escapart is easily defeated by Bevis in the ensuing lines. It is notable that Escapart is in a position of enslavement or servitude throughout the whole text. He begins as Garsi's champion, is defeated and enslaved by Bevis, and when he is abandoned, he voluntarily turns to King Eor. Escapart's backstory further emphasizes this submissiveness. Mirroring the Anglo-Norman, he too was ostracized for his size and mockingly compared to a dwarf. However, unlike Escapart, who of his own accord came speedily to this land, Escapart is presented in a more degrading light, revealing he was driven from his town. In this text, this act shows an element of comedy. In creating a character of such outrageous size, his comparison to a dwarf and act of fleeing creates an absurd juxtaposition which lessens his otherness. The fight scene brings this comic belittlement to a crescendo. Unlike the brutal battle of the Anglo-Norman, where Escapart is presented as a worthy and dangerous opponent to Bove, in the Middle English the fight is very short and anticlimactic. In fact, the dialogue the two share is longer than the fight itself. The battle is portrayed as very one-sided, and the giant is defeated in a humorous but lackluster way when he falls over his own feet. This scene is also extremely emasculating. Although Escapart's strength is praised for lifting his club, he doesn't get the chance to use it and is defeated almost immediately. It is clear that this scene in the Middle English places Escapart outside of the boundaries of humanity, creating a character of extreme excess which serves to balance out Bevis's heroism. As in the Anglo-Norman, the giant is marked as not only disproportionate among humans, but also giants. Yet the scene also experiments with Escapart's presence, bringing him deeper into the narrative and establishing a character with memorable personality. He is simultaneously too aggressive and too passive, too large to conquer yet perpetually governed. He sits on the border of hybridity, showing many physical features of monstrosity, yet his villainy is somewhat mitigated through his comical impotence. Instead of the gruesome, stereotypical monsters seen in the Anglo-Norman, the Middle English presents a trivialized character, blurring the boundary between human and other. The next pivotal moment, which challenges the boundaries of otherness in the text, is the betrayal scene, arguably the most significant aspect in the characterization of the enslaved giant. In the Anglo-Norman, the moment of betrayal is abrupt and jarring. When Bove is preparing to leave England, he asks Escapart to stay behind, addressing him as my friend. In thanks for his service, he grants him a city and 200 knights. This generous gift is framed with the reminder that Bove has baptized Escapart and given him his father's name, clearly placing Bove firmly in the role of benevolent and saintly knight. Yet in response, Escapart unexpectedly betrays Bove to his enemy, King Ivory. The sharp contrast between this impressive gift and Escapart's extreme reaction shows a resurfacing of his monstrous traits, and the scene quite obviously incriminates Escapart, whilst portraying Bove as an unjustly scorned hero. This scene relies on the giant's physically monstrous form to justify his actions, and subsequently, his death seems a justifiable end to his stereotypically monstrous character. As in his first scene, Escapart is placed firmly outside of the boundaries of humanity, portrayed as an outsider and characterized by his excessive monstrosity. He undergoes no character development throughout the text, and dies as he was created, a villainous Saracen. This scene is remarkably different in the Middle English text. Whilst the basic plot remains the same, and Escapart still betrays Bevis, the details of the moments leading up to the betrayal are notably different. I would argue, in the Middle English betrayal, Escapart's otherness is somewhat mitigated, as a measure of blame is attributed to Bevis. In giving the giant a degree of justification and logic, his villainy is lessened to an extent. The absence of the clear-cut hero and villain roles leads to a blurring of the boundary between human and other, bringing this monstrous figure deeper into the narrative and experimenting with his hybridity. This is done in three ways. Firstly, there is an element of abandonment not seen in the other text. In the Anglo-Norman, Bove departs with a young boy called Terry as his undefined companion and servant, yet in the Middle English he clearly appoints him as his squire. In the medieval household, the position of squire outranked that of page. This is especially relevant considering Escapart's position as Bevis's page has been clearly emphasized throughout the text. Therefore, this scene leading up to the betrayal sees Escapart replaced by a younger human who is given a rank higher than him. Secondly, the way in which Escapart discovers that Bevis has replaced him is integral to his betrayal. In the Anglo-Norman, Bove tells him directly, asking him to remain with Sabbath. However, in the Middle English, it appears that Bevis leaves Escapart to discover his abandonment for himself. The use of wiste on line 3412 is key, meaning to know or to have knowledge. Considering this, the line reads, when Escapart knew of this. This phrasing implies Bevis merely abandons and discards Escapart, and as a result, the giant is portrayed as an unjustly neglected figure, which is emphasized by the absence of the rewards seen in the Anglo-Norman. Thirdly, Escapart is given logical justification to betray Bevis. Whilst the Anglo-Norman gives no reason other than Escapart's inherent monstrosity, in the Middle English the lines following Bevis's departure are tantalizingly ambiguous. This extract is particularly significant. Upon a first reading, this appears to show that Escapart betrays Bevis because he has fallen in poverty and few remain loyal to him. However, the he on line 3416 is ambiguous. It can either refer to Bevis in the previous line or to Ascapart as the subject of the line before this. If the latter is the case, then this changes the entire meaning of the extract. This suggests that now that Bevis has abandoned Ascapart, he has fallen into poverty, giving him a justifiable reason for turning to another master for servitude. This makes sense considering that although Bevis has been exiled to England, he still has funding and resources from his supporters, meaning that he would be far from poverty. Furthermore, this statement is relevant to Ascapart. As an exiled giant, he would have no allies or companions. The use of man here does not limit this reading. Earlier in the poem, it is used to refer to Ascapart, and it is widely accepted that man is used as if it were a universal category throughout Middle English writing. This scene portrays two very different perspectives of the enslaved giant character. The Anglo-Norman depicts Ascapart as a one-dimensional monstrous giant, bereft of human morals or loyalty despite the feudal exchange that takes place. Right up to his death, he remains firmly outside of the boundary of humanity, and he continues to fill the role of enemy to highlight Beau's heroism. Contrastingly, the Middle English displays a more complex character, which sits on the boundary of hybridity, at times understandably human, yet inexorably monstrous. Impartially shifting the blame of Ascapart's betrayal, Bevis is presented as a somewhat culpable master who abandons his page and leaves him in poverty. The stereotypical role assumed by a monstrous giant here is less decisive. The distinction between hero and villain is somewhat blurred, and Ascapart is allowed to step outside of the confines of the orthodox giant trope. The character's monstrosity is not completely revoked, as he still goes on to cruelly capture Josiane, but his decision to betray Bevis is far more justified in the later text. This study has attempted to show the contrasting portrayal of the enslaved giant trope in these two fundamental texts in the Bevis-Tradition. I hope that I have shown that the differences between the Anglo-Norman and Middle English texts portray very different versions of Ascapart, which truly influences characterization in regards to the boundaries of otherness. The Anglo-Norman text portrays a figure of complete otherness, situated firmly outside of the physical and symbolic boundaries of humanity, using Ascapart as a plot device to fill the role of a monstrous enemy to counter Beau's heroism. Both his introduction and betrayal scene follow the orthodox notion of monstrosity, relying on his physically monstrous form as a justification for his villainous acts. In contrast, the Middle English text experiments with Ascapart's hybridity, creating a character who straddles the boundary between human and other. In bringing Ascapart deeper into the narrative, he is given more agency than is usually allowed to a supernatural enemy. Instead of a clear-cut monstrous figure, Ascapart's character is broadened and explored, brought into the light with motives and emotions usually only allowed to human characters. In displaying fear, loyalty, and greed, he surpasses the orthodox giant trope, and in elements of his character enters the realm of humanity. Whilst his monstrosity cannot be denied, his physical presence, Saracen origin, and betrayal of Bevis are reminders of his role as enslaved giant. He displays certain human characteristics which result in a character who blurs the boundaries between human and other. In allowing him such agency, the Middle English text exploits his hybridity to create a platform to explore what divides the monster from the other. I recognize that this difference might exist to enable the narrative, as an attempt to correct the previously incomprehensible plot hole created when Ascapart, a previously obedient servant, betrays his master with seemingly little justification. However, when you consider the complexity of their relationship throughout the text, I believe a conscious effort is being made here to mitigate Ascapart's monstrosity to an extent. Although this is a very limited study, I would argue that these texts occupy an important position in the Bevis-Tradition as an example of the development of the concept of monstrosity in early Middle European literature. Their experimentation with the boundary between human and monster, specifically through the lens of the enslaved giant trope, offers unique insight into the changing understanding of otherness in this period. Thank you.